The art of verbal warfare has evolved little since Niccolò Machiavelli penned his observations on power and human nature in Renaissance Italy. In the marble halls of Florentine palaces, where a misplaced word could mean exile or death, the prince learned that the tongue could be as sharp as any blade. Today, in boardrooms and family gatherings, on social media, and in political debates, the same principles apply. He who controls the conversation controls the outcome. Consider the moment when Senator Margaret Chase Smith faced down Joseph McCarthy in 1950. As McCarthy's accusations of communist infiltration reached fever pitch, Smith rose in the Senate chamber. She did not shout, did not counter with her own accusations, but instead delivered a measured statement that began, "I think that it is high time for the United States Senate and its members to do some soul-searching." Her words, delivered with surgical precision, dismantled McCarthy's credibility more effectively than any heated rebuttal could have achieved. This was Machiavellian strategy in action, the application of calculated restraint to achieve maximum impact. The foundation of such devastating verbal responses lies not in aggression but in understanding the psychological architecture of confrontation. When two people argue, they are rarely debating facts. They are defending territories of ego, challenging perceptions of status, and wrestling for the invisible crown of being right. The person who recognizes this fundamental truth holds an insurmountable advantage. Machiavelli understood that fortune favors not just the bold but the prepared. In his correspondence with Francesco Vittori, he wrote of studying his opponents as a general studies terrain before battle. The modern practitioner of sharp rhetoric must similarly map the landscape of any potential confrontation. This means understanding not just what someone believes, but why they need to believe it. What insecurities drive their assertions, and what contradictions lie buried in their reasoning. The executive who storms into a meeting demanding explanations for missed deadlines reveals more than frustration. They expose their fear of appearing incompetent to their superiors. The family member who brings up old grievances at every gathering shows their desperate need for validation and acknowledgement of past hurts. The colleague who constantly interrupts demonstrates their anxiety about being overlooked or undervalued. These psychological pressure points, once identified, become the precise locations where a well-placed response can end a confrontation instantly. The first pillar of argument-ending responses is the mastery of silence and timing. In the heat of argument, most people feel compelled to respond immediately to defend their position with increasing volume and decreasing effectiveness. The Machiavellian approach requires the opposite: strategic pause, calculated delay, and the recognition that he who speaks first often speaks from weakness. When the opposing party finishes their tirade, the natural human tendency is to fill the silence immediately. Resist this impulse. Let the silence stretch until it becomes uncomfortable, until their words hang in the air like smoke, dissipating and losing their force. This pause serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates that you are not reactive or emotional. It forces them to confront the echo of their own words, and it positions your eventual response as measured and thoughtful rather than defensive. The power of a perfectly timed response was demonstrated in 1988 when Lloyd Bentsen faced Dan Quayle in the vice presidential debate. When Quayle compared his experience to that of John F. Kennedy, Bentsen waited, let the comparison settle, and then delivered. "Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." The pause before the response, the measured delivery, and the devastating parallel structure ended not just that exchange, but arguably Quayle's political credibility in that moment. The timing of such responses is not accidental. It requires reading the emotional temperature of the room, understanding when your opponent has committed fully to their position, and recognizing the moment when they are most vulnerable to a devastating counter. This vulnerability often comes not at the beginning of their argument, but at its peak, when they have invested maximum emotional energy and have nowhere higher to escalate. Physical positioning during these moments matters more than most realize. Stand or sit slightly higher than your opponent when possible, but not so obviously as to appear theatrical. Maintain steady eye contact, not as a challenge, but as someone completely comfortable with scrutiny. Keep your hands visible and relaxed. Hidden hands suggest hidden agendas, while fidgeting hands betray nervousness. Your body language should communicate absolute confidence in your position before you speak a single word. The construction of the response itself follows principles that Machiavelli would recognize: economy of language, precision of target, and devastating effectiveness. The most powerful argument-ending responses are rarely long speeches. They are surgical strikes that expose the fundamental weakness in the opponent's position or character. Consider the response that uses their own logic against them. When someone argues from a position of moral superiority, the most effective counter often involves applying their stated principles to a situation where they have acted differently. You say honesty is the most important value in business, which makes me curious about how you explained the Denver project to the board last month. This approach doesn't argue against their principle, it forces them to confront their own inconsistency. The redirect response takes their attack and turns it into an indictment of their character or judgment. When accused of being too cautious in decision-making, the Machiavellian response might be, "I prefer careful analysis to the kind of impulsive decisions that lost us the Morrison account." This acknowledges their criticism while simultaneously highlighting a concrete failure on their part. The elevation response rises above their argument to expose its pettiness or irrelevance. When someone nitpicks details or process, the devastating counter might be, "While you're focused on who sent which email when, our competitor just signed 3 of our biggest prospects." This doesn't defend the details, it makes the entire argument seem trivial in comparison to larger concerns. The exposure response reveals the true motivation behind their attack. This seems less about project timelines and more about the fact that I was chosen for the promotion committee. This type of response is particularly devastating because it forces them to either admit their real motivation or continue arguing from a position everyone now sees as dishonest. The second pillar involves understanding and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities that drive most argumentative behavior. Every person carries within them a collection of fears, insecurities, and unresolved conflicts that influence their reactions to challenge. The skilled practitioner of verbal warfare learns to identify these pressure points and apply force with surgical precision. The most common vulnerability is the need to appear competent and knowledgeable. When someone argues aggressively, they are often compensating for a deep fear that others will discover they don't know as much as they pretend. The response that exposes this gap can end arguments instantly. I'm curious about the methodology you use to reach that conclusion, particularly how you accounted for the variables we discussed in the Stevens report. This forces them to either admit they haven't done their homework or attempt to bluff through territory where they lack expertise. Status anxiety drives much argumentative behavior. People argue not because they disagree with facts, but because they fear losing face or position in the social hierarchy. The response that threatens this status while maintaining plausible deniability can be devastatingly effective. That's certainly one perspective, though I imagine the board will want to hear from someone with more direct experience in this area. This doesn't directly insult their competence, but it subtly suggests that others might not value their input as highly as they believe. The need for control manifests in people who argue about process, procedure, and protocol. They focus on how things are done because they cannot control what gets done. The response that highlights this displacement can stop such arguments immediately. You seem very focused on the meeting schedule rather than whether we can actually deliver what the client needs. This exposes their fixation on controllable minutiae while real problems remain unsolved. Fear of being excluded or overlooked drives many workplace arguments. People argue for inclusion in decisions not because they have valuable input, but because being excluded feels like a threat to their relevance. The response that acknowledges this fear while maintaining boundaries can be both kind and final. I understand your interest in being involved. The decision requires expertise in areas outside your current responsibilities, but I'll make sure you're updated on any outcomes that affect your work. Some people argue as a form of attention-seeking behavior, particularly in group settings where they use confrontation to ensure they remain the center of focus. The response that removes this reward while exposing the behavior can end such patterns quickly. It seems like you have some strong feelings about this. Perhaps we should schedule time to discuss your concerns privately so we can focus on the agenda today. This doesn't engage with their arguments but instead treats their behavior as a separate issue that doesn't belong in the current context. The manipulation of group dynamics forms a crucial component of argument-ending strategies. Most arguments do not occur in isolation. They happen within the context of relationships, hierarchies, and social structures that can be leveraged to achieve victory without direct confrontation. Understanding alliance structures within any group provides enormous advantages. Before entering any potentially contentious situation, map the relationships. Who respects whom? Who has historical conflicts? Who benefits from different outcomes? When an argument begins, position your responses to activate these existing dynamics rather than fighting against them. When someone argues aggressively in front of colleagues they wish to impress, they become vulnerable to responses that make them appear petty or unprofessional to that audience.
I think we're getting into territory that might be better handled offline.
I'm happy to discuss your concerns after the meeting so we can focus on the agenda items everyone else needs to address. This frames their behavior as disruptive while positioning you as considerate of others' time and needs. The strategic use of witnesses can end arguments before they begin. When you anticipate confrontation, ensure that respected third parties are present or involved in the communication. Before we discuss this further, let me loop in Sarah since she has the background on the client requirements we're debating. This introduces an objective voice while making it harder for the other party to argue from emotion rather than facts. Group pressure can be applied indirectly by appealing to shared values or common objectives. We all want this project to succeed, so let's focus on what the data tells us rather than our personal preferences. This creates social pressure for rational discussion while making continued argument appear selfish or obstructive. The reframing technique takes their argument and places it within a context that makes it appear unreasonable or counterproductive. When someone argues for their preferred approach, reframe the discussion around outcomes rather than methods. The question isn't whether your approach is good, but whether it's the best way to achieve what the client actually wants. This shifts the burden of proof while making continued argument about methods appear short-sighted. The third pillar centers on the construction and delivery of responses that carry maximum psychological impact. The most devastating verbal responses share certain characteristics. They are unexpected, they reveal uncomfortable truths, and they leave no clear path for retaliation. The unexpected angle attacks from a direction the opponent hasn't considered or prepared for. Instead of defending against their accusation, question the underlying assumption that makes their accusation relevant. When accused of being uncooperative, don't argue about your level of cooperation. Instead, respond, I'm curious what specific outcome you're trying to achieve because I may be able to suggest a more effective approach. This sidesteps their frame entirely and positions you as solution-focused rather than defensive. The uncomfortable truth response forces them to confront something they would rather ignore. When someone argues for a course of action that serves their interests while claiming it serves the greater good, the devastating response makes this explicit. This proposal would certainly solve your budget problems, though I'm not sure how it addresses the client concerns that brought us here. This doesn't accuse them of selfishness directly, but it makes their self-interest impossible to ignore. The no retaliation response is constructed so that any attempt to continue arguing makes them appear unreasonable. I can see this is important to you. Help me understand what success looks like from your perspective, and then we can figure out the best way to get there. This is difficult to argue against because it appears collaborative while actually putting them in the position of having to clearly define their objectives, which often reveals the weakness of their position. The professional jujitsu response uses their aggressive energy against them by remaining completely professional while they become increasingly emotional. I appreciate your passion on this topic. What specific data would help you feel confident in the direction we're taking? This maintains focus on facts and solutions while highlighting the contrast between their emotional state and your rational approach. The strategic concession acknowledges something minor while winning the larger point. You're absolutely right that the timeline is aggressive. Given that constraint, we should probably focus on the approaches most likely to succeed rather than trying to accommodate every possible preference. This gives them a small victory while positioning your preferred approach as the obvious choice given the constraints you've both acknowledged. Advanced practitioners understand that the most powerful responses often work on multiple levels simultaneously. They address the surface argument while also communicating about status, competence, and social dynamics. When a colleague publicly challenges your recommendation, the response, "That's an interesting alternative." Walk me through how you see it addressing the compliance issues Janet raised last week. Accomplishes several things. It treats their challenge seriously. It requires them to demonstrate knowledge they may not possess, and it connects their alternative to complications they likely haven't considered. The meta-response addresses not just their argument, but the fact that they are arguing. I notice we seem to be spending more energy debating this than we are solving it. What would need to happen for you to feel comfortable moving forward? This elevates the conversation above the content to the process, often revealing that their objection isn't really about the topic at hand. The time shift response moves the discussion to a different temporal frame that makes their argument irrelevant. When someone argues about past decisions or mistakes, don't defend the past. Instead, respond, "You're right that we could have handled that differently. The question now is how we use what we've learned to make the best decision going forward." This acknowledges their point while making it clear that dwelling on it is unproductive. The implementation of these strategies requires careful attention to context and consequences. The goal is not to humiliate or destroy relationships, but to end unproductive arguments efficiently while maintaining the possibility of future cooperation. This requires calibrating the force of your response to the severity of the situation and the importance of preserving the relationship. In high-stakes professional environments where careers and reputations hang in the balance, responses must be devastatingly effective while maintaining plausible deniability. The language should be precise enough to end the argument, but diplomatic enough to allow the other party to save face. I think we may be operating from different sets of assumptions. Perhaps we should verify the client requirements before we continue this discussion, stops the argument while suggesting that better information will resolve the disagreement. In personal relationships, where long-term harmony matters more than immediate victory, the approach shifts toward responses that end the argument while opening paths toward resolution. It sounds like we both want the same thing but have different ideas about how to get there. Help me understand what's most important to you about this. Stops the adversarial dynamic while moving toward collaborative problem solving. The timing of argument-ending responses often determines their effectiveness. Deploy them too early, and you may escalate rather than conclude the confrontation. Deploy them too late, and positions may have hardened beyond the point where a single response can shift the dynamic. The optimal moment usually comes when the other party has fully committed to their position, but before they have invested so much ego that backing down becomes impossible. Reading the signs that indicate this optimal timing requires attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. When someone begins repeating the same points with increasing intensity, they are approaching maximum commitment. When their language becomes more absolute, always, never, everyone knows, they are closing off alternative perspectives. When they begin personalizing the argument, you people, typical, they are transitioning from disagreeing with your position to attacking your character. The physical manifestations are equally telling. Rising voice volume, increasingly animated gestures, and invasion of personal space all indicate escalating emotional investment. The skilled practitioner watches for these signs and strikes during the brief window when the person is fully committed, but before they become completely inflexible. The aftermath of a successful argument-ending response requires careful management. The immediate goal has been achieved, the unproductive argument has stopped, but the longer-term relationship dynamic still needs attention. The person who has been effectively silenced may feel embarrassed, angry, or resentful. How you handle these emotions determines whether the victory was tactical or strategic. The gracious follow-up acknowledges their perspective while maintaining your position. I know we see this differently, and I value having people who challenge my thinking. Let's make sure we circle back once we have more information. This validates their right to disagree while making it clear that the current argument is over. The collaborative redirection moves from argument toward joint problem solving. We clearly both care about getting this right. What information would we need to feel confident about the decision? This transforms former adversaries into partners in seeking solutions. The professional reset simply moves forward without dwelling on the confrontation. Let's focus on next steps, or the important thing now is delivery. Signals that the argument is over and it's time to return to productive work. Understanding when not to deploy these techniques is as important as knowing how to use them. Some arguments serve important purposes. They surface genuine disagreements that need resolution. They allow people to express legitimate concerns, or they reveal information that changes the optimal course of action. The wise practitioner distinguishes between productive disagreement and pointless argument, engaging fully with the former while efficiently ending the latter. The true master of Machiavellian argumentation understands that the most devastating response is often no response at all. Sometimes the most powerful move is to deny the other party the argument they seek. "I'm not going to debate this with you," delivered calmly and with finality, followed by a transition to other topics, can be more effective than any clever comeback. This approach works particularly well with people who argue primarily for attention or emotional release rather than genuine disagreement about substance. The strategic use of documentation can end arguments before they begin. When someone has a pattern of arguing positions they later deny or claiming they weren't properly informed, the simple response, "Let me forward you the email chain where we discussed this," stops the argument while creating accountability for future interactions. The elevation to authority can end arguments by removing the decision from the realm of debate. "This is outside my authority to change. You'll need to take it up with DET." Stops the argument while directing their energy towards someone who can actually address their concerns. Cultural and generational considerations affect the choice and delivery of argument-ending responses. What works in a traditional corporate hierarchy may backfire in a collaborative startup environment. What resonates with one generation may alienate another. The sophisticated practitioner adapts their approach to the audience while maintaining the core principles of precision, timing, and psychological insight. In diverse environments, responses must account for different communication styles and cultural expectations around conflict. Some cultures value direct confrontation as a sign of honesty and respect. Others see it as inappropriate and counterproductive. Some generations expect formal courtesy even in disagreement. Others prefer casual authenticity. The effective response acknowledges these differences while achieving the objective of ending unproductive argument. The digital age has created new venues for argument and new opportunities for argument-ending responses. Social media arguments often spiral out of control because participants feel pressured to respond publicly and immediately. The devastating digital response must account for the permanent, public nature of the medium while achieving the same objectives as face-to-face confrontation. The strategic non-engagement response works particularly well online. "This seems like a conversation better had in person. I'll reach out to you directly." This signals that you're taking the disagreement seriously while removing it from public view, making continued public argument appear petty or attention-seeking. The factual correction response provides accurate information without engaging with the emotional content of their argument. For anyone following this discussion, the actual numbers are SACs. This corrects misinformation while making it clear that you won't engage in public debate about interpretations or implications. The expertise redirect defers to appropriate authority while maintaining your position. I'll let Dr. Smith address the technical aspects since this is her area of expertise, but I stand by my analysis of the business implications. This acknowledges limitations in your knowledge while maintaining authority in your domain. The development of argument-ending skills requires practice in low-stakes situations before deploying them in high-consequence confrontations. Start with minor disagreements and difficult conversations where relationships can survive mistakes and outcomes matter less. Practice the timing, the language, and the follow-up until these responses become natural rather than scripted. Role-playing exercises with trusted colleagues can help refine both the content and delivery of these responses. Have them argue various positions while you practice different approaches, paying attention to which responses feel authentic to your personality and communication style. The most effective responses feel natural to the speaker while being devastating to the recipient. Study masters of this art form in action. Watch experienced negotiators, skilled politicians, and effective executives handle confrontations. Notice how they control their emotional state, time their responses, and choose their words for maximum impact. Pay particular attention to how they end arguments without destroying relationships, as this is often the most challenging aspect of the skill. The psychology of argument reveals that most confrontations are not really about the stated topic. They are about power, status, respect, and recognition. Understanding these deeper motivations allows for responses that address the real issue rather than just the surface disagreement. When someone argues about process, they may really be arguing about their relevance. When they argue about timelines, they may really be arguing about their competence being questioned. When they argue about resources, they may really be arguing about their value being recognized. The Machiavellian insight is that acknowledging these deeper needs while maintaining your position often proves more effective than arguing about surface issues. I can see this touches on something important to you. Help me understand what you need from this situation. Often ends arguments more effectively than any factual rebuttal because it addresses the emotional reality driving the confrontation. Advanced practitioners understand that their reputation for handling arguments affects their effectiveness in future confrontations. When word spreads that you handle disagreements professionally and decisively, most people become more careful about picking fights with you. This reputation becomes a form of deterrence that prevents many arguments from starting. Building this reputation requires consistency in your responses. You must handle small disagreements with the same professionalism and effectiveness that you bring to major confrontations. People watch how you treat those with less power or status, and these observations shape their expectations for how you will handle challenges to your authority or position. The long-term strategic approach recognizes that some arguments are worth avoiding entirely through careful relationship management and preemptive communication. When you know someone has strong opinions about a topic, address their concerns before they become arguments. When you anticipate disagreement, share your reasoning and acknowledge valid alternative perspectives before opposition solidifies. This proactive approach follows Machiavelli's principle that it is better to prevent problems than to solve them after they arise. A brief conversation that acknowledges someone's expertise and explains why their preferred approach isn't being used prevents the argument that would arise when they discover the decision has been made without their input. The mastery of argument-ending responses ultimately serves larger objectives than simply winning confrontations. It preserves energy for important battles, maintains relationships necessary for long-term success, and establishes the kind of professional reputation that opens doors and creates opportunities. The person known for handling disagreements with grace and effectiveness becomes someone others want to work with, not against. In the boardrooms and battlefields of modern life, those who master the art of ending arguments hold significant advantages. They can focus their energy on productive activities rather than draining confrontations. They build reputations as problem solvers rather than problem creators. They maintain relationships that serve them throughout their careers. The Machiavellian approach to argument recognizes that the goal is not to be right, but to be effective. Sometimes being effective means winning the argument decisively. Sometimes it means ending the argument diplomatically. Sometimes it means avoiding the argument entirely. The skilled practitioner knows the difference and chooses the approach that serves their larger objectives. The true power of these techniques lies not in their use, but in their restraint. When others know you possess the skills to devastate their arguments, they become more thoughtful about challenging you. When they know you will only use these skills when necessary, they trust you to handle disagreements fairly. This combination of capability and restraint creates the kind of respect that makes leadership possible and relationships sustainable. The techniques outlined here are tools, not weapons. They should be used to improve communication, resolve conflicts, and achieve positive outcomes, not to humiliate opponents or inflate egos. The practitioner who uses these skills responsibly finds that they face fewer arguments over time, not because people fear them, but because people trust them to handle disagreements professionally and fairly. In the end, the greatest practitioners of argument-ending responses are remembered not for the battles they won, but for the conflicts they prevented and the relationships they preserved. They understand that true power lies not in defeating others, but in achieving objectives while maintaining the respect and cooperation necessary for long-term success. This is the essence of Machiavellian wisdom, the recognition that effectiveness and morality need not be opposing forces, but can be aligned in service of worthy objectives. The path forward requires practice, reflection, and continuous refinement of these skills. Start with small applications in low-risk situations. Pay attention to the responses that work and those that backfire. Develop your own style and approach while maintaining the core principles of timing, precision, and psychological insight. Remember that the most powerful response is often the one that transforms an adversary into an ally, that turns a confrontation into a collaboration, that ends an argument while beginning a solution. This is the ultimate goal, not just to win arguments, but to transcend them entirely, creating relationships and outcomes that serve everyone involved. The legacy of Machiavelli's insights extends far beyond the political machinations of Renaissance Italy. In every human interaction where conflict arises, where egos clash, and where arguments threaten to consume valuable time and energy, these principles remain relevant. The person who masters them gains not just tactical advantages in individual confrontations, but strategic capabilities that enhance every aspect of their professional and personal life. The choice now lies before you. Will you remain a victim of other people's need to argue, constantly drawn into unproductive confrontations that drain your energy and damage your relationships? Or will you develop the skills to end arguments decisively while maintaining the respect and cooperation necessary for long-term success? The techniques are here, tested by centuries of human conflict. The only question is whether you will commit to mastering them. In a world where everyone seems to want to argue, the person who can end arguments holds extraordinary power. Use it wisely, use it sparingly, and use it in service of objectives worthy of your time and energy. The future belongs to those who can transcend conflict, not just engage in it. Master these skills, and you master one of the most valuable capabilities in human interaction: the ability to move beyond argument toward achievement.